News Guardians on Fox Radio 910.
And we are back, and so happy to have not only James with us this morning, but Melissa. Good morning, Melissa.
Good morning. I'm glad I found you.
The neighborhood's like an obstacle course, and you never know which street they're going to have blocked or why, because it doesn't seem to have a whole lot to do with what they're actually doing.
It's good that I wasn't on the radio in my car, because we would have an FCC fine for sure right now.
I've got a couple of stories and a topic I'd like to talk with you all about today. But first, since we've talked so much about the local elections in Roanoke City lately, I wanted to ask because there's not been a Libertarian candidate for local office in my memory in our area. And I wanted to see what your perspective was on the issues that were talked about amongst the candidates this time around. Primarily, I think what really got hit on was the level of debt that the city has incurred, buying stuff. The crime issue and the level of crime that the statistics show that Roanoke has, as well as the level of tax and regulation in Roanoke City. So let's start with debt. Roanoke City takes in about $250 million in revenue a year, and it is $328 million in debt. What do you think about that? And is that a healthy situation for a local government to be in?
How much of that has been driven by what's going on at Elmwood?
Elmwood Park was $7.6 million of that 328. There's a lot of things wrapped up in it. It was the building of the football stadiums, the cost of tearing down Victory Stadium, the purchase of land that they hope to be able to sell to Carillion, the school projects, upgrading of libraries. There's a lot of building projects that have gotten wrapped up in that debt situation. Because of the interest rates, which are at 3%, that's what the city's paying for interest. There is, I think, $31 million a year is what the city has to pay just in interest on the borrowed money.
Well, not to oversimplify, but obviously, Roanoke City should not be spending more than it makes. So I'm wondering.
Well, let me give you their argument.
Is this an upfront thing where down the road they're thinking these things that they're building are going to be bringing in revenue?
Well,
and
the school,
if I may,
sure.
One knee-jerk reaction. A lot of the things you mentioned are things that local government shouldn't be involved in. Buying and selling land, it's not a role of local government to be a land developer. They're supposed to be providing quote-unquote essential government services. Building and tearing down football stadiums is not an essential government service. Building a park or an amphitheater, I don't mind a park or an amphitheater, but is that an essential government service? And again, land speculation, if they're buying land just in the hopes that Carillion will come and buy it back from them someday, that's a ridiculous waste of taxpayer money.
Well, and in one of those pieces of property, they actually spent hundreds of thousands of dollars adjudicating the theft of a private property owner's property down on Reserve Avenue using eminent domain, when the city didn't plan on actually using the land for itself. It planned on holding it so that it could become part of a Carillion project, which is a private entity. That's
but then Carillion didn't buy it, if I recall correctly.
No, Carillion did not buy it,
right.
So that was just a great big mess.
Right.
And
the fact that eminent domain was used there is an outrageous.
Well, and to James' point, I agree with you. I don't think a lot of these things are the central core functions of a local government. And that was and the other thing that you all said, that was the argument. They argue that things like this amphitheater, while it may have cost $7.6 million and we had to borrow the money to do it, it's going to bring so many people and so many things into the city that we're going to make it up in tax revenue. It's going to be, they look at it as an investment. Now, We've asked, and nobody has yet been able to provide any kind of financial numbers to show just how the return on the investment is going to look and at what point we will have made money on the $7.6 million that was spent.
I'm sorry, you're saying they haven't provided that information?
No.
There's a lack of transparency.
Well, it's because you
Probably
can't.
doesn't exist.
Right. How can you quantify how much money is going to be brought in through the taxes based on the money spent by people who may come to Roanoke to go to an event at Elmwood Park? I mean, it's a ridiculous thing in the first place.
But it may be difficult to quantify, but surely before there's that much spent, there was a business case done, so there should at least be an estimate of what they're expecting to happen.
Oh, Melissa, you have
Is that naive?
You have such grandiose hopes for our local government.
I'm sorry. I have one other maybe question.
Okay.
I know isn't it Roanoke City that is doing the new police thing with all the data analysis and that whole crime center that they have? That's Roanoke City, I believe.
I thought it was the county, but it may be the city.
Maybe it's
a lot of times I just see Roanoke and I'm just kind of breezing through things
Right,
and I don't catch which,
okay.
but it may be. Yeah, it may be. But here was my point on that situation was that if we're spending $31 million a year just to pay the interest, not to pay off the principal, just to pay the interest, in 1 year, that would have been enough money to buy 4 Elmwood Parks with some money left over without having to borrow a dime. We're about to go into $80 million of spending to fix the stormwater drainage issues that Roanoke has had for a long time. Now, $80 million, you may say, well, we'd have to borrow to do that and then pay it off. We might, but if we weren't spending $31 million a year extra to pay off just interest on debt, we could have saved that $31 million over 2 or 3 years and had enough to pay cash for the repair of the fact that we've gone down the debt road at some point has now put us in a situation where the city can't be fiscally it can't experience any kind of prosperity because it's behind the 8 ball perpetually. And when you try to explain that to people, and this is going to lead into the topic that I actually want to talk to you all about today, when you try to explain that to people,
warm up.
Yeah, they look at you like you're crazy. They don't understand. They don't understand what the core functions of government are. They don't really understand, from a liberty perspective, what individuals should be doing in their communities and what government should be doing in their communities. And they don't understand the enormous drag that debt has on an individual, on a family, on a government, on a community.
I agree with what James said, that local governments need to take a long look at what their actual function is before undertaking these things. With that said, as a separate issue, if they're going to undertake them, they need to do it in a fiscally responsible way, in the same way that a business would. If a business took on, they would know what the return on the investment was going to be. They would not be going into debt to finance these things.
At one point...
But for politicians, return on investment is winning the next election.
Right. They're investing tax dollars in projects to make people happy to get votes.
Exactly.
That's the ROI. Because when we asked about this situation, when they tried to justify the $7.6 million for Elmwood Park, they said, well, the Civic Center cost such and such, and we did it the exact same way, and it takes a loss because it's just something you have to have. I mean, they actually look at the millions they lose every year on running the Civic Center as just the cost of having a Civic Center, and we're just supposed to be okay with that. Because you have to have a Civic Center. You don't have a city unless you have a Civic Center, right?
The Civic Center has a lot of events in it. Is there
I know, and it still runs a loss. They lost over $1 million last year.
Does that seem odd?
Well, I think it seems odd. It seems odd in the context of an asset like that, where you already own it, should be able to produce income based on how much it's getting used. But then again, government's the one running it. I mean, is government really qualified to run an asset like a Civic Center in a way that makes money?
And that circles back to the point you made earlier. The argument is often made by politicians and bureaucrats that these quote-unquote investments are going to pay for themselves in the long run through increased tax revenue. I'm sure that argument or one similar to it was made when the Civic Center was being considered, and now here we are so many years later, and the Civic Center is still losing money. So that return on investment from a financial perspective never develops.
Well,
but again, the politicians don't care about that.
They're able to use this mystery amount that's over here to try to cover up for the actual loss. Because, well, sure, it lost over $1 million directly, but that doesn't account for all of the money that got spent in taxes that don't run through the books of the Civic Center that the city actually got because those events brought people to town. Now, I'm okay with that argument if you can show me on paper what it is. If you can show me that the tax dollars brought into the city were $3 million, otherwise, we would not have had that money were these events not held at the Civic Center. If it's an open shut case, then you netted $2 million. On the Civic Center's books, you lose $1 million, but ultimately you can see where the money is. We don't have that in this case. They want us to just believe in
just have faith.
Right, this magical income.
There were hotel revenues and food. Right, yeah.
So I asked this because obviously, we were helping 3 candidates last election cycle, and lost, and we thought we were being, extremely reasonable with what we wanted to do, extremely reasonable about the very issues that I'm talking to you about, and still by a margin of almost 2-1 in some cases, the people with the message like we're discussing here were beaten badly. So the question is, and this is something that I've experienced in statewide elections, in local elections, in congressional elections, in General Assembly elections, is that first I discovered that liberty wouldn't win an election as an issue. It's not winning an election. Moderating liberty and trying to give people what they consider to be an appropriate amount of what I would consider almost BS, but dumbed down liberty for people who accept a little bit of statism in their lives because they just don't know the difference. That doesn't win either. So and the Libertarians, when they have a candidate run, gets a single digit, where is there no constituent? Do we not have a majority of voters that will vote for freedom as the core issue and the core answer to the problems that we have?
I think a couple of things about that, and James, please jump in here. But
yes.
To the dumbed down part, I think we have a lot of work to do. We have libertarian ideas are not something that we can easily just sort of spoon feed people, and the reality is that's what a lot of people are used to, having their politics sort of spoon fed to them. I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, this is what I think, I don't really have to think about it. And I think if we fall into that because we're focused on this election that's right in front of us, we're not focusing on sort of the long range thing, which is changing the way that people think about government. And we have a lot of work to do there because it's just not been what we talk about. And I think that's what has to happen. Well, we have to be doing the hard work about being out, having conversations with people about what it means and how it affects them in the larger sense.
Well, there was a time when generally people understood our perspective on what government's responsibility was. When this country was created, the people who created it and the people who lived in it, they didn't believe that government's role was to tell them what they could say or how long the grass could be in their yard, or all of the things that we accept as and not all of us accept them, but generally society accepts these governmental controls. None of that would have been okay to Americans 150 years ago. They had a much more congruent understanding of government than we do. But long about the early 20th century, when the socialist movement was happening around the world, they had a socialist party, a very vibrant one in the United States, but it couldn't win. It didn't even come close. So I think what they did is what you're saying. They decided to just educate people on why socialism is awesome and then down the road someday we'll end up with a country full of socialists that'll just vote for the things that we can't get them to vote for now. And that's essentially what we're doing. They actually think that Social Security is a good and appropriate way for you to plan for your retirement, to have the government just take your money away and then decide later on how much to give you back. They think that's the way it should be. You couldn't have gotten an American 150 years ago to go along with that.
I mean, if you dropped somebody from 150 years ago, if you put them in the TARDIS and brought them forward to now and dropped it down and they saw the regulation, they would think that's insane. But we all are immersed in it. We've lived with it, and it doesn't seem that strange. Which is why we need to make the case for why it's a big deal. But I think we have to sort of the thing we have to get people away from is this there ought to be a law mentality. You know, this thing is bad and there ought to be a law. And if you disagree with that, you know, this isn't a big deal. Why are you making such a big case out of this? Because there is a larger issue. There's always a larger issue, and that's the discussion that we need to be having with people.
It took them about 80 years to get us to where we are now, which means if we were to stop focusing on trying to fight issues and trying to fight elections and strictly to try to take over educating the next 4 generations of Americans, then it would probably take us about the same amount of time to raise generation after generation that understood liberty instead of this, you know, overcomplicated statist situation that we have. I mean, we'll never live to see that. Even if we started now, we're not going to get to see that day.
I do think if you look at the polling of younger people, I think you're seeing more of a libertarian trend among them, and I think that should give us some hope at least. And I think the just massive growth of regulation, eventually it impacts people in some absurd way, and that makes it easier to have a conversation with them. Once they've had some absurd regulation impact them, then you can use that to say, this is what we're saying. You know, they're maybe more open to listening to you.
Well, and it looks like Ron Paul, that's the direction that he's decided to go with his work, is to not try to become president anymore. Instead, he's created an educational curriculum, and he's talking about educating generations of Americans in liberty. And I think he may have the most viable pathway way back, although I'm too impatient to wait for that.
I don't know if you're familiar with Jeffrey Tucker, but Jeffrey Tucker is an anarchist who does a lot of good work, and he has a sort of a similar philosophy that we just need to focus on being free, and
we'll be back.
You're rapping.
Yep. We'll be back after the break. Don't go away.
This is News Guardians. With Greg Aldridge and Chip Tarbun on WFJX Fox Radio 910.
And we are back on Libertarian Wednesday with both James and Melissa. Good morning. It is so good to have you here.
Good morning.
Good to be here.
Now, to wrap up the topic we were talking about, so that's my problem, is that I don't think we can win an election on liberty in the electoral environment that exists today. So
I think we just have a lot of work to do.
Then how do you explain libertarians who do win elections?
Well, in any electoral situation, there are things that fall outside of the bell curve because of special conditions. And in any election that I've been involved in that we lost, you know, I can look at things and go, well, if this had happened, it would have changed everything. If this had happened, it would have changed everything. If the Democrat had gotten caught with kiddie porn and the media actually reported it, we might have had a chance to win. I mean, there's always conditions with which circumstances can make the hard or impossible actually possible, and that I love those. And I'm always looking, you know, when I'm working in elections, I'm always looking for what is that thing that could totally flip this on its head and make it possible for us to win.
And this is a legitimate question. So the candidates that ran in Roanoke City, from what I saw, and I'm really asking the question here, they focused primarily on fiscal issues. Would that be a fair statement?
It was probably, I would say it was probably at least 2/3 fiscal, and then 1/3 was, all the other issues around, like one was the core services not being taken care of. We knew there was a stormwater issue 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They ignored it until the very last minute, which is why now we have a catastrophe. But yeah, it was 2/3 the fiscal situation in the city, and then all the other stuff.
I wonder how a message would have been received, and I'm not saying that fiscal issues are not libertarian, because certainly they are, but libertarians, focus on other freedom issues as well that are typically not found in Republican campaigns. So I'm wondering how a truly libertarian message would be received in a city like Roanoke or somewhere that's just strongly blue, when you bring in sort of the other issues that might appeal to voters on the other side.
I think it probably wouldn't be radically different than our discussions with the average person around here when we talk about those issues. I don't find an overwhelming number of people when I talk with them about, like, zoning, for example, what color you're allowed to paint your house, how tall you're allowed to have your grass, how many dogs you can have. When I talk with people...
Can you have an emu?
Well, exactly. When I talk with people about basic just property rights issues like that in the context of these situations, I talk to someone like you and we're like, yeah, this is all a bunch of crap. But when I talk to the average person, they're like, well, I don't want my neighbor's grass to be 2 feet tall because it hurts my property values. I don't want them to have 5 chickens because I don't want to have to listen to them. I don't think they should be able to paint their house purple because I don't like that color. Most of the people I talk to think that kind of bossing around of people by local government is perfectly okay because they don't want those people to be able to do whatever they want to do. I can't even find just in day-to-day life that great a constituency for freedom just at a local level. So personally, I don't think they do very well, and I don't like that. But why don't we try?
So let's find a candidate. So what about a message that's, and I'm going to be radical here, sorry to you listeners out there. What about a message that was, hey, maybe we should focus less on putting people in jail for marijuana and a little bit more on the crime rate in Roanoke?
I think there's, with the drug criminalization issue, there is an ever-growing number of people that are tired of the criminalization. They're not all because they're doing drugs. Just because they think this whole situation's gotten out of hand.
People are starting to realize that we were telling the truth. It wasn't about us wanting to use marijuana. It was about the enormous cost, both financially and probably more importantly on civil liberties and liberty in general. People are starting to hear that message.
I think we might have to run a state election on that issue because since the Commonwealth's attorney actually sits at the pleasure of the Attorney General, Roanoke couldn't decide, well, we're just not going to prosecute that stuff anymore.
Well, Charlottesville did something similar. Charlottesville City Council, they can't obviously change it, but they did say it's not going to be a focus for us.
Well, and that you can do, but I'm skeptical of political people. That to me sounds like they're trying to pacify a group of people on something that you won't really be able to tell for sure if they're really doing or not, so it makes some people happy. Because
well, if there is legitimately, if the data shows a crime issue in Roanoke, then someone should focus on it. Someone should say, maybe we shouldn't focus on this. Maybe we should instead look at the real violent crimes.
Well, and
maybe it would be an empty political thing, but somebody needs to do it. Somebody needs to.
But I want to win that election. So what I'm saying is the test here is, can we win? Could we win a local election on a just strict libertarian platform and talk to people about what their lives would be like and how government would run if libertarian principles were applied in Roanoke? I mean, it's worth a try.
A candidate has to be willing to have those sort of controversial, making people uncomfortable conversations, and I think that would be fantastic. If nothing else, it's just an opportunity to be out having the conversations.
Another hurdle we as libertarians have to overcome is now we've seen in the last couple of decades, and especially more so in the last few years, members of other political parties love calling themselves libertarians or using that term or using the language of liberty to sell their form of government control. So now we also have to, when a libertarian candidate comes out and talks about libertarian principles, it's hard to distinguish that from the chatter, because a lot of what we talk about has been talked about by other folks who don't deliver. So from the, untrained, from the average citizen listening to just another candidate talk about things that they may or may not deliver on, we've been, the libertarian brand has been damaged somewhat recently by others who like to call themselves that and really don't follow through. And also, to be fair, some libertarian candidates haven't done a very good job of expressing the message of liberty, because often somebody will, as Melissa mentioned, it's hard to find libertarians willing to step forward and run for office. And often when somebody does, they want to focus on financial issues because that's where their training is or that's where their interest is. And they're not as well versed in expressing libertarian ideas in regards to social issues or how the two interact. One of the failings I see of libertarian candidates is we fall into the trap of pretending that you can separate social from economic issues, and you can't. They are joined at the hip. Every political issue is both a social issue and an economic issue, and often also a moral issue. And you need to approach the voters from all three of those perspectives. And from all three perspectives, the libertarian solution is often the best solution. And part of it is we just need to have better trained candidates. Obviously, we need more candidates. One of the problems with the Libertarian Party is most libertarians aren't interested in politics as a solution to problems. And most libertarians don't want to, even if we think libertarian ideals are great, we don't want to be put in a position where it's being confused that we're imposing libertarian ideas on people. So we often have a hard time pushing back against people who view libertarianism as some sort of infringement instead of an expansion of liberty.
Well, and the kind of people who don't want government running their lives don't get up every day wanting to run government.
Exactly.
Which is why those aren't the kinds of people in government. It's the kind of people who get up every day wanting government to control everything, fix everything, and be in charge of everything. Those are the kinds of people that want to be in charge of government. And so, therefore, we have a government full of people who want to boss everybody else around because they think they know better. That's essentially how we got here. And to your other point, I mean, you're right. I think Democrats and Republicans both will talk about freedom, liberty, and the Constitution, yet the Democrats think that forcing us against our will into government social programs like Obamacare, like Social Security, like, name your federal program that they force us to give money to, and then, they give it to somebody or they'll give it back to us under some certain condition. They think that's okay. And then Republicans think that the drug war and the war on terror and violating the Fourth Amendment, that's okay. But while on one side of their mouth they're talking about Constitution and freedom, and the other side of their mouth they're talking about how we need to let the NSA, snoop into every part of our lives to save us from the boogeyman. So you're right, they have destroyed people's understanding of what the Constitution and what liberty really is, because many people probably think the nonsense that the two big political parties spew is what it's about, and it's not even close. It's not even in the ballpark.
And that is a real issue. We've had a system of education, and I hate to use the term indoctrination, but I can't find a better word at the moment. We've been trained as an electorate that there are two political parties, and you vote for one or the other. You don't like one, you vote for the other. And then when people figure out they don't like that one either, well, this person seems reasonable, so I'm going to vote for the person, not the party, and ignore the fact that that person answers to a party. And so we just get this ping-pong effect of people bouncing back and forth between political parties. It's a political Ponzi scheme, as I like to call it. But a new breed of politicians will step forward and say, well, I'm different from that last generation. I'm a new type of Republican or a new type of Democrat, and I'm not going to make the same mistakes that my predecessors did, but their predecessors are still running the party, and their predecessors are the people they answer to if they want to advance their political career. So ultimately, they do make maybe not the same mistakes, they just make a new batch of mistakes. And again, the message of freedom gets watered down in the process.
Yeah, freedom is not getting to choose whether you're going to go to Burger King and McDonald's. Freedom is choosing whether or not you're going to go eat fast food at all.
I would argue that, well...
And that's not the choice we're going to be given. We're given these, freedom is the list of choices that they've already approved for us. And people think that because they still have some choice, they don't see the fact that their choices have been limited artificially. And that's why they think they're still free.
I think to the original question that you had,
can we win with a libertarian message?
I mean, one enormous hurdle there is the wasted vote argument, and just having spent the last few years sort of on the ground in libertarian campaigns, that's the biggest hurdle. Is people, when there isn't an election, libertarians are fantastic. They love us. We're great. And then when there is an actual campaign, people, it's like a bunker mentality. We have to beat the other person, and so you have to vote for the lesser of two evils, and people become just hostile, and we're stilling the election.
Well, I'm not popular for believing this with a lot of the people that I work with because they're in the Republican Party. But they're dead set on the idea, like, for example, that the Libertarians are why Ken Cuccinelli lost last year. And I tried to explain to them that Sarvis pulled just as many Democrat votes as he did Republican votes.
He pulled 2-1.
And that's just ridiculous. Yeah. Now they're not going to buy it because it doesn't fit the mold. Now that might be true in certain cases. It may have been true at a certain period of time in our recent American history. But last year in that election, unless somebody can actually pull the votes of every single person who voted and who they would have voted for under other conditions and prove to me that that's how it went down, what it seems to look like to me is Sarvis got votes from both sides, and it really didn't have any effect on whether the Democrat or the Republican won.
In general, libertarian campaigns will pull from both sides. In this campaign, the exit polling is not great. It's not a great, reliable way, but it's the best that we have, and it showed Sarvis pulling 2-1 from McAuliffe. Before that happened, had you asked me before the election, I would have said, just anecdotally, what I was seeing when we were out working booths and in the community is that we were getting support from the left. But there are Republicans who are absolutely 100% convinced that we stole the election from Ken Cuccinelli. And so that just makes it harder the next time. The next time they can say, look, you stole that election from Ken Cuccinelli, and the Libertarians are single-handedly responsible for bringing socialism to Virginia.
Now,
I think that's pretty much
what they need to focus on was the election was stolen by 6,000 votes up in Fairfax that didn't exist until they needed to create some extra votes to make sure that Mark Herring was the Attorney General. That was where the election was stolen. It was in absentee ballots that miraculously appeared during the recount that nobody knew existed during the regular election.
Well,
that's the stealing of the election.
Just take responsibility for it. If your party isn't winning elections and you're angry that your party isn't winning elections, then look at your party. Don't blame it on us. Look at what's going on in your own party.
Did you have something?
I've heard from Democrats who were upset with Sarvis that we almost cost them the election. Mm-hmm. So as Melissa alluded to earlier, we get it from both sides. Mm-hmm. And so I find it funny when I hear from my Republican friends and colleagues that libertarians are taking votes from Republicans, because I hear the same thing from my Democratic friends and colleagues, and I wish I could get them all in the same room together at the same time if they realized that if they all voted for what they actually wanted, going back to your original premise that libertarians only pull single-digit votes, we would do much better if the people who voted actually voted for what they wanted, and then we could build upon that and bring in new voters. Because where libertarians do best, where libertarians do win elections, when we bring in quote-unquote new voters, people who otherwise just stay home, They're not interested in Democrat, Republican. They're not interested in political solutions to their lives, the problems that they face in their lives. And when a libertarian comes along and says, I'm not going to offer you a solution other than get the government out of your way, people respond to that pretty well. I guess I'm a little more optimistic about the electorate than you are. Well, I think freedom sells itself, and I think people have a natural tendency to want to be free, including to want to be free from government.
Well, we got one more segment. Let's try to cap that idea off when we return after this break, because I got a couple of questions then to see how we would deal with some of the libertarian items in an electoral sense. When we are back on Libertarian Wednesday with Melissa and James, this is the News Guardians on Fox Radio 910.
News Guardians on Fox Radio 910.
And we are back to the fastest hour in local radio, the News Guardians. Thanks for listening. We still have local libertarians, James and Melissa, here with us. And we are, I guess, going to wrap up our discussion on the ideas of liberty, and do we have enough of an electorate out there to vote for them? Can we win on liberty principles in an election? And here's my question. My libertarian values and constitutional principles tell me that the government doesn't have the authority to take my money and put it into a Social Security program and then decide after I'm retired, based on who ends up in Congress and a congressional vote, as to how much of my money I get back, if I even get back any at all. I don't think they have the authority for that. So the perfect candidate for me would be one that recognizes that and wants to work to fix that problem. But when you have over a third, in many places and even more in others, of the electorate who actually are receiving that Social Security money, how are we going to get those people to vote completely against the self-interest that the government has artificially given them? Because if we end Social Security, then every dollar we've ever put into it, every dollar that those people are pulling out of it, ends. How do you get people to vote for that? It's right, it's constitutionally correct, but it's not going to be popular with the electorate.
Most plans I've heard for ending Social Security, to use that as an example, call for some sort of phase out. So that if somebody's already receiving Social Security benefits, or they're within a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever cutoff of being eligible for those benefits, they would still be eligible. So I've not heard I've heard of very few programs, even from libertarians, that would just call for ending Social Security immediately, and your check would not arrive in the mail next month. I guess it's direct debit or bank card or whatever it is now. I don't know if checks still come in the mail from the government.
No, they do it by card so that the bankers can make 3% off of every dollar you spend.
There you go. So very few programs would end something like that immediately, and this ties into a bigger discussion of flipping the switch and ending a program immediately, or phasing it out. I think something like Social Security, that's been around as long as it has, that is entrenched in the American psyche as much as it is, would have to be phased out. And if you go back to your 1/3, there are people who receive Social Security who recognize the damage that it's doing to future generations, and would give up those benefits, or be willing to receive reduced benefits, or certainly be willing to vote for a phase out that wouldn't affect them directly. So, just because a certain percentage of the population receives Social Security or even some other government benefit, there is, believe it or not, some folks there who would be willing to give up that benefit if it meant more freedom.
Do you think it's weird that you can't get the Chamber of Commerce to actually be on the side of a candidate who's fighting for economic liberty? That they are against those candidates because they're already bought into getting government to pass laws and to give grant money and to manipulate the economic system to their benefit so that they have control. And this is what I ran into in the last 3 elections dealing with Chamber of Commerce. I thought if you had a candidate who was going to free the businessman up to do business again and free individuals up to be entrepreneurs, that Chambers of Commerce would be all over that. But what I discovered was then they lose this grant over here, and they lose this tax money here that's going to buy advertising for this industry over here, and they don't want any of that. They like the government control of these things. That was that was a very disappointing realization, is that Chamber of Commerces aren't actually about free commerce. I was sorely disappointed.
That is disappointing.
The music is playing, so we have 22 seconds. Yeah, I told you, the fastest hour in radio.
And we didn't get to talk about any news stories.
No, which we'll do again. We'll be back with our Libertarian friends next month, the second Tuesday of every month tonight, if you want to go to their meeting. It's at Corn Beef and Company, 7 o'clock, downtown Roanoke. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day. We'll see you tomorrow.